You've probably heard of the Apostle Paul. I mean, he's a giant in Christianity, right? His letters make up a huge chunk of the New Testament. But there's a catch. We're going to dive into the 13 letters with his name on them because there's a textual mystery here that has had scholars scratching their heads for centuries.
And that mystery? It all comes down to this one really big question. It's a debate that honestly opens up this incredible window into what the early church was really like. It makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about authorship and, authenticity back in the ancient world.
Okay, so scholars have basically sorted these 13 letters into two piles. On one side, you've got the 7 undisputed letters. Pretty much everyone agrees, yep, that's Paul. But on the other side, we've got 6 letters that are the subject of some pretty intense debate. And the differences between these two groups, well, that's exactly what we're here to investigate. All right, here's our game plan. We'll set the stage, then dig into the 3 big clues that make people question things: the author's voice, the message, and the historical setting. Then we'll flip the script and look at the case for Paul. And finally, we'll talk about why this whole debate actually matters. It's not just for academics, I promise. So for a long time, people reading these letters in the original Greek started noticing things. Little inconsistencies. The letters in that disputed pile just felt different. The words were different, the style was different, even the core ideas seemed to have shifted. And that's what kicked off this deep, fascinating debate about who really wrote them.
So, our first piece of evidence is all about the author's textual fingerprints. It's a field called stylometry, which is just a fancy way of saying we're analyzing the writing style, the vocabulary, how sentences are built, all the little ticks that make a writer sound like themselves.
And a really key tool for these textual detectives is something called hapax legomena. It sounds complicated, but it's a Greek phrase for a super simple idea. It's a word that an author only uses one time. And these unique words, they can be a massive clue. Okay, check out this number, 306. What's so special about it? Well, that's how many words show up in what are called the pastoral letters, that's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, that appear, get this, nowhere else in any of Paul's other writings. That is a seriously high number. It's something you just can't ignore. And this chart really puts that number into perspective. We're talking about over a third of the entire vocabulary in the pastorals being completely unique to just those 3 letters. Now, if you're a language analyst, that's a huge red flag. It practically screams that a different author might be holding the pen. But it's not just about the words themselves, it's the whole vibe. The undisputed letters, like Galatians, they feel raw, passionate, almost like Paul is dictating them in a hurry to put out a fire. The sentences are urgent, sometimes a little messy. But then you read the disputed letters, like Ephesians, and it's a different world. It's formal, it's polished. The Greek has these incredibly long, elaborate sentences. It feels less like a spontaneous letter and more like a carefully crafted theological essay. Okay, so that's clue number 1. Clue number 2 is about a shift in the substance itself. It's not just how it's written that changes, it's the core ideas, the theology. And scholars point to some really significant differences between the 2 sets of letters here. Let's take the Greek word pistis, which we translate as faith. In Paul's undisputed letters, it almost always means a person's individual trust in Christ. It's a relationship. But in the pastorals, the meaning changes. It becomes the faith, like a set body of teachings, the official Christian religion. It's a subtle change, but wow, it's a profound one. And you see the same kind of thing with church structure. In the undisputed letters like Corinthians, Paul talks about a community that's really led by the Spirit. You have roles like apostles and prophets. There's no talk about a rigid formal hierarchy. But then you jump to the pastorals and suddenly the focus is all about establishing church offices with these detailed lists of qualifications for bishops and deacons. This points to a much more developed institutional church, something from a later time perhaps. And that idea of a later time brings us right to our third clue, the historical setting. The 2 sets of letters, they just seem to be written for completely different moments in the life of the early church. They're trying to solve very different problems. Paul's undisputed letters are what you'd call occasional. They're written to deal with specific, immediate problems. For instance, he's arguing with other Jewish Christians about the role of the Mosaic Law. But the disputed letters? They're warning against these strange heresies about myths and endless genealogies, which sounds a lot like Gnosticism, a movement that really took off in the 2nd century, not the 1st.
And on top of all that, if you try to map out Paul's travels based on letters like Titus and 1 Timothy, it's almost impossible to make them fit the timeline of his life we get from the book of Acts. And then there are these really subtle rhetorical clues. One is this fascinating concept scholars call the anxiety of fiction. So in 2 Thessalonians, the author basically stops and says, hey, look, this is really me writing this. See my signature. But Paul never does that in his undisputed letters. He doesn't have to. And that kind of defensive move, that over-prostation of genuineness, can actually be a dead giveaway of a forgery.
Okay, so that's a pretty compelling case, right? But this debate is far from over. So let's be fair and look at the other side. The arguments for why Paul could have written all 13 of these letters despite all these differences.
Defenders have some really strong points. First, Paul used secretaries, or amanuenses, to actually write down his letters, so different scribes could totally explain the changes in style. Second, you have to think about the audience. Of course, he would use different language when writing to a trusted friend about church business versus writing to an entire congregation about deep theology. And finally, people change. It's entirely possible that Paul's own thinking, his own style, just evolved over his long career. And this brings up one of the most clever counterarguments out there. Think about it. If you were trying to forge a letter from someone as famous as Paul, wouldn't you try your absolute best to copy his style perfectly? The fact that the disputed letters are so different could, paradoxically, be a sign they aren't forgeries. A good forger would have been a much better mimic. So, we've looked at the evidence for and against. But you might be wondering, so what? Why does this matter? Well, this isn't just about winning some ancient historical argument. What we decide here tells us something really profound about the birth of Christianity itself. Because here's the thing. Whether these letters were written by one guy or by a bunch of people carrying on his legacy, they all, together, tell a story. They give us this incredible, almost real-time snapshot of a religion finding its feet.
And that story is a story of evolution. It's the story of a shift from a charismatic, spirit-led movement built around these incredible figures, like Paul, to a more structured, institutional religion that's focused on preserving tradition and setting up leadership. And the letters, they capture that evolution as it's happening.
Which leaves us with one last big question to think about. See, in the ancient world, writing in the name of your revered teacher wasn't always seen as deception. It could be a way of honoring them, of carrying their legacy forward. So it forces us to ask, what does authentic really mean? Does a text's power come from who physically held the pen, or from the ideas it has carried through 2,000 years of history?
So today, we're going to crack open a case file on a really fascinating linguistic detective story. It's all about some of the most influential and, most debated letters in the New Testament. We're going to follow the clues hidden in the language itself to try and solve a literary mystery that's centuries old. Let's get into it. Right, so here it is, the big question that's had scholars scratching their heads for generations. We have 13 letters in the New Testament that all say they're from Paul. But when you look really closely at the language, it starts to look like some of them might have been written by someone else. And this is way more than a simple yes or no question. It really opens up this whole world of historical and textual investigation. Okay, so at the absolute heart of our investigation are these 3 letters, what we call the pastoral epistles. They're not written to whole churches, but to 2 of Paul's colleagues, Timothy and Titus. And, right away, scholars noticed something was off. The tone, the focus on administration, the whole style. It just feels so different from letters like Romans or Galatians. So to figure out why, we've got to look at the evidence, starting with the actual words on the page. Our first clue comes from the vocabulary. Seriously, think of it like a linguistic fingerprint left at the scene of the crime. When you start analyzing the words used in these pastoral letters and then you compare them to Paul's other, undisputed letters, a really clear pattern just jumps right out at you. Get this, a full 36% of the words in the pastoral epistles don't show up anywhere in the 7 letters we are absolutely sure Paul wrote. 36%. That is a huge chunk of vocabulary. This isn't just some minor little variation, it's a massive difference that really needs an explanation. And here's where it gets fascinating. This unique vocabulary, it's not random at all. These words start popping up all over the place in other Christian writings from the early 2nd century. Take the word eusebia, which means godliness. It's in the pastorals 10 times, but it's almost totally absent from Paul's core letters. The same thing happens with words for endurance, and this is a big one, specific titles for church leaders, like bishop and elder. All of these are super common in the letters of a church father named Ignatius of Antioch. So what does this all mean?
Well, this difference in vocabulary shows a massive shift in what the community was focused on. Paul's undisputed letters talk about leadership in these really charismatic terms: apostles, prophets. But the pastorals and Ignatius, they're using language for a structured, formal hierarchy. Paul talks about pistis as a personal trust in Christ, but the pastorals and Ignatius use that exact same word to mean the faith, like a set of correct teachings. They're speaking a shared language because they share the same concerns.
Okay, so they share a bunch of key words. Case closed, right? They must be connected. Well, hold on. Not so fast. Our investigation is about to take a really unexpected turn when we zoom out from single words and look at the broader patterns of writing style. I mean, it's the logical next question, isn't it? Given how much vocabulary the pastorals and Ignatius share, you would totally expect their overall writing styles to line up pretty closely. But when we actually put that idea to the test, the results are, well, surprising. We can actually do this with a cool technique called stylometry. It's a way of analyzing things like sentence lengths, grammar, and word frequency to create a unique fingerprint of an author's style. It lets us mathematically measure how similar two texts are. And this is where our mystery gets a huge plot twist.
And the results are kind of shocking. Even though the pastorals share all that unique vocabulary with Ignatius, the stylometric analysis shows that Ignatius's writing style is actually closer to Paul's authentic letters than the style of the pastorals is. The pastorals are the real odd ones out. So how on earth can they share specific vocabulary but have such wildly different writing styles?
Well, here's the breakdown. Paul's authentic letters, and Ignatius's letters too, they're known for this passionate, almost breathless rhetorical feel with these long, complex, flowing sentences. The pastorals, on the other hand, are much more formal and instructional, with shorter, tidier sentences. One of the biggest tells is the use of these little Greek words called particles that link ideas together. They are everywhere in Paul's writing, but in the pastorals, they've practically vanished. So all of this brings us to the big question, why? Why these specific words? Why these totally different styles? The answer, it seems, lies in the changing world of early Christianity. The language itself is a mirror, reflecting a faith that was in transition, facing a whole new set of problems that needed a new way of talking. Yeah, we saw this earlier with the word faith. For Paul, it's this deeply personal act of trust and reliance. But for the author of the pastorals and for Ignatius, who are writing maybe a generation or two later, the faith has become something you can hold, a set of teachings, a body of doctrine that has to be protected from mistakes. It's a subtle shift in a single word, but it's absolutely profound. See, by the early 2nd century, the church just had different priorities. It wasn't a small, charismatic movement anymore. It was becoming an institution that needed real structure. The focus totally shifted to building a clear hierarchy, defending sound doctrine, and warning against what they considered heresy. This is the world that's reflected in the language of both the pastorals and Ignatius. So at the end of the day, that shared vocabulary and all those shared themes in the pastorals and Ignatius, they point to a very specific moment in history, a time when the church was getting more organized, more institutional, and maybe a little more defensive. It was just a different world, with different problems than the one Paul was writing for back in the middle of the 1st century. Okay, so we've got all this evidence on the table now. The unique words, the stylistic weirdness, the historical context. We can finally ask the million-dollar question. If Paul didn't write the pastorals, then who did?
All right, the most common view among scholars is something called the pseudonymous authorship hypothesis. The theory goes that a really devoted but anonymous follower of Paul wrote these letters in his teacher's name, maybe in the late 1st or early 2nd century. The goal wasn't really to trick people, but to use Paul's authority to tackle the new problems the church was facing, like setting up leaders and fighting heresy.
But that's not where the story ends. The really strong connections we've been tracing, especially all those linguistic ties to one particular buy, have led some scholars to float a much more specific and honestly way more provocative theory about who the author might be. And here it is, the Ignatian authorship hypothesis. This idea suggests that all these clues, the shared vocabulary about godliness, endurance, and especially the whole church hierarchy thing, they all point a finger directly at Ignatius of Antioch, or maybe someone in his inner circle. Could the very person whose writings helped us identify the unique language of the pastorals actually be their author? And the motivation would have been huge. Ignatius was a massive champion for a strong church structure led by a single bishop.
By writing in Paul's name, he could basically give his vision for the church the ultimate apostolic stamp of approval, a vision that was totally central to his own letters and ministry. It's a bold theory for sure, but it does a pretty good job of connecting all the linguistic dots we've uncovered.
And that just leaves us with one last, really crucial question to think about. Whether they were written by Paul, or an anonymous follower, or even Ignatius himself, these letters have shaped Christian thought for 2,000 years. But how does our understanding of where a text comes from, who wrote it, affect how we read it today? What, if anything, does it change about its meaning or its authority? That's the real puzzle at the heart of this whole investigation.
All right, welcome. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to become detectives. We're looking at some of the most famous ancient texts in the world, but with a new set of eyes, not just as sacred books, but as literary artifacts packed with hidden clues about who wrote them, when they wrote them, and even why. So let's start with the big question, right? Who really wrote the books of the Bible? It sounds like a straightforward question, but oh man, the answer is anything but. For centuries, we've had traditional names attached to these books. But what if the texts themselves are telling a different story? What happens when we actually look at the evidence baked right into the pages?
I want you to think about it like this. An ancient text is kind of like a crime scene. Every single author, whether they know it or not, leaves behind clues. They have their own unique style, their favorite words, a certain rhythm to how they build their sentences. These are their literary fingerprints. And by analyzing these little clues, we can uncover a whole history that's sitting just beneath the surface. So let's grab our magnifying glasses and dive in.
Okay, first up, case file number 1. This one is all about the Apostle Paul. Now, we have a bunch of letters in the New Testament with his name on them, but a few of them, specifically 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which we call the pastoral epistles, they just sound different, suspiciously different. So the question is, are we actually hearing Paul's voice, or is this the work of a ghostwriter?
Let's start with the hard evidence, the vocabulary. Take a Greek word like eusebeia, which means godliness or piety. In the letters we're sure Paul wrote, like Romans or Galatians, he basically never uses it. But in the pastorals, it's everywhere. Same goes for this heavy focus on the official qualifications for church leaders like bishops and elders. And here's the kicker. This exact vocabulary pops up all the time in other Christian writings from the 2nd century, like from a guy named Ignatius of Antioch. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, these letters were written in a different time period altogether.
And it's not just about specific words. The whole meaning of big ideas changes. When the real Paul talks about faith, he means this radical, dynamic, personal trust in Jesus. It's a verb, an action. But when you get to the pastorals, it suddenly becomes the faith, a static, defined body of doctrine. It's a noun, a thing you have to guard and protect. This shift tells us we're probably dealing with a later community, one that's less about revolution and more about building institutions.
Now, to make sure this isn't just a hunch, scholars have this amazing tool called stylometrics. And no, this isn't just about someone's opinion or gut feeling. This is basically the science of text analysis. It's like literary forensics. We can measure average sentence length, how often certain little words are used, grammatical habits, all to create a statistical profile of an author's unique style. It's their literary DNA.
So, what does the literary DNA test show? Well, Paul's authentic letters are famous for these long, complex, passionate, run-on sentences. They're a wild ride. The pastorals, completely the opposite. They're short, formal, and structured. They read more like an instruction manual for a church. But what's really wild is that the letters from Ignatius, that 2nd century writer, they're actually stylistically closer to Paul. It looks like Ignatius was trying to imitate Paul's style. The pastorals, though, they are a total stylistic outlier. The data is pretty clear.
All right, let's close that file for now and move on to case file number 2. We're shifting gears from the letters to the Gospels, where we find a really fascinating literary puzzle. It's a case of a mysterious character who might be a clever literary invention with a very surprising origin story.
First, we have to look at a piece of outside evidence. This is not from the Bible. It's from a 1st century Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus. And he tells this unbelievable story where he's with the Roman army and sees 3 of his old friends being crucified. He pulls some strings, gets them taken down from the crosses, and one of them actually survives. Just let that sink in. A respected man intervenes, gets crucified men taken down, and one lives. Okay, now let's jump over to the Gospels. Who do we meet there? A man named Joseph of Arimathea. And what does he do? He goes to the authorities, the Romans, and gets permission to take Jesus' body down from the cross. A man named Joseph who intervenes with the authorities to get a crucified man taken down. Are you hearing the echo here?
And this is where it gets really good. This is the big reveal. The historian's full name wasn't just Joseph. It was Joseph bar Matthias. The character in the Gospel is Joseph of Arimathea. Arimathea, bar Matthias, you hear that? It's so close. A lot of scholars think this is no accident. It's a sophisticated literary clue, a pun. It seems the Gospel writer knew Josephus's work, borrowed the core of his story, and then created this character, Joseph of Arimathea, as a clever little nod to the original source.
Okay, for our third and final case file, we're zooming out a bit. We're asking a totally different question. How did any of these texts, these personal letters, these narratives, end up becoming scripture with a capital S? Because, it didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process that we can actually watch unfold in the historical record. So check out this piece of evidence. It's from a letter called First Clement, written from Rome to the church in Corinth right around the year 96. The author's trying to sort out a fight they're having, and he says, "Hey guys, remember that letter the blessed Apostle Paul wrote to you? Go dig it up and read it again." This is huge. It tells us that by the end of the first century, Paul's letters weren't just being read and thrown away. They were being saved, shared, and used as a source of authority.
But, and this is the critical clue, look at how Clement talks about Paul's letter. He calls him a blessed apostle, and he's pointing to his letter as a good example from the past. He is not quoting it in the same way he quotes from the Hebrew Bible, which he clearly calls scripture. For Clement, Paul is a foundational figure, an incredible authority, but his letters haven't yet made that final leap to being considered the literal word of God. That would come later. So, after all this detective work, after dusting for literary fingerprints and tracing the origins of stories, what's the final verdict? Why does any of this actually matter for how we read these ancient documents today?
Well, what our investigation shows is that the story behind the stories is way more complex and, frankly, more interesting than we usually think. We've seen that authorship can be layered, that writers left behind undeniable stylistic fingerprints, and that they even used really creative literary tricks, like puns based on other books they were reading. And maybe the biggest takeaway is that the journey from a respected letter to divine scripture was a long one. And you know what? Knowing this doesn't diminish these texts. It makes them richer, more human, and so much more fascinating.
So I'll just leave you with this to think about. When we understand the literary puzzles, the historical back and forth, and the very human hands that shape these ancient texts, how does that change the way we approach them today? Thanks for coming along on this investigation with me.
Okay, so in the New Testament, we have these 3 letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They're all attributed to the Apostle Paul, and they're basically instruction manuals for young church leaders. But for centuries, scholars have had this nagging feeling that there's more to the story. We're about to dive into a really fascinating literary puzzle, one that might just challenge what we think we know about these really important texts. And this right here is the central question we're tackling today. Now, we're pretty certain about 7 of Paul's letters. They're widely considered authentic. But these 3, the ones we call the pastoral epistles, they just stand apart. They feel different. And today, we're going to play detective and figure out exactly why. So I want you to think of this as a literary detective case. You've got scholars acting like textual forensic experts. And over the years, they've spotted all these little inconsistencies in the vocabulary, the writing style, the whole historical vibe that suggests these letters might not be from Paul at all, but maybe from a later follower writing in his name. So let's grab our magnifying glass and look at the evidence, one clue at a time. All right, our first line of evidence is the vocabulary itself. See, every author has a kind of unique verbal fingerprint, right? The words they like to use, the ones they avoid. And when we put the words in the pastoral epistles under the microscope, we find some pretty striking anomalies. Now get ready for this number, because it's a big one. Out of 848 different words used in the pastorals, a staggering 306 of them appear absolutely nowhere else in Paul's undisputed letters. That is a huge number of new words. It really suggests we might be hearing a different authorial voice. This chart really helps put that number into perspective. We're talking over a third of the entire vocabulary is unique to just these 3 letters. I mean, think about it. If you wrote a bunch of emails to a friend, and then suddenly in the next few, a third of the words you used were completely new, they'd probably notice something was up, right?
And here's the thing, it's not just that there are new words, it's which new words they are. Terms like eusebia, which means godliness or piety, are all over the pastorals, but they're totally absent from Paul's other letters. But you know where they do show up? They were super common among Christian writers in the 2nd century, guys like Ignatius of Antioch. It's like a linguistic breadcrumb trail leading to a later time period.
Now, this right here is a bit more subtle, but it's an absolutely profound shift. In his authentic letters, when Paul uses the word faith, that's pistis in Greek, he's almost always talking about a personal trust, a relationship with Christ. But in the pastorals, it's become the faith, a fixed set of beliefs, a body of doctrine that has to be protected. This really points to a later, more institutionalized phase of Christianity.
Okay, let's move on to our second clue and see how this all builds, the author's writing style. We're not just talking about word choice anymore. This is about sentence structure, rhythm, tone, an author's unique way of putting everything together. It's their authorial fingerprint.
And wow, the contrast here is just stark. I mean, if you read Paul's letter to the Galatians, it's like listening to this urgent, passionate, sometimes even angry argument. His Greek sentences can be incredibly long and complex. But the pastorals, they're calm, they're formal, they're instructional, with much shorter, more straightforward sentences. It feels less like a personal letter and a whole lot more like a church manual. This little phrase is a perfect example of that formal, almost formulaic style. It shows up 5 times in the pastorals, always to introduce some trustworthy piece of teaching. It's like a stamp of approval. And it's a set formula that we just don't find in Paul's more spontaneous, authentic letters. It really hints at a time when traditions were being collected and solidified into these tidy little maxims. Our third and final clue takes us into the world behind the text. What kind of problems are these letters trying to solve? What's going on in the community? This is where the vocabulary and the style that we've just been looking at, well, this is where it all starts to make perfect sense. So here's the crucial point. The world of the pastorals looks a whole lot like the early 2nd century. The author is deeply concerned with establishing a formal church structure, with bishops and elders and deacons. They're fighting specific heresies like Gnosticism, which was this movement that claimed you needed secret knowledge for salvation. And they're obsessed with preserving sound doctrine. These were the defining challenges for the church a full generation, or maybe even more, after Paul's death. So, we've got clues from the words, the style, and the worldview. But what happens when we bring modern technology into this investigation? Well, this brings us to the really cool field of stylometry. Stylometry is basically using computers to do what we've been doing by hand, but on a massive scale. It maps an author's unique fingerprint by analyzing hundreds of linguistic variables. It can then cluster text together, providing some really powerful quantitative evidence about who wrote what. And when scholars run this analysis, the result is completely unambiguous. Paul's authentic letters, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, they all cluster neatly together. But the pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus, they form a completely separate group. The computer is telling us that, statistically speaking, this is a different author. And now for the real knockout finding. This is just amazing. The analysis shows that another early Christian writer, Ignatius of Antioch, who we know is active in the early 2nd century, he actually imitates Paul's style more closely than the author of the pastorals does. That is a stunning piece of evidence. It suggests the pastorals are even further from Paul's authentic voice than we thought. So, where does all this leave us? Well, all the clues, the vocabulary from a later era, the formal institutional style, and a worldview concerned with 2nd century problems, they all point in the exact same direction. The dominant view in scholarship today is that the pastorals were written pseudonymously. That means a loyal follower wrote them, using the Apostle Paul's authority to help address the new and different challenges that were facing the church in the next century.
And this brings us to the final, really crucial question. Knowing that these letters likely come from a later time doesn't have to diminish their value, not at all. But it does change how we read them. It shifts them from being Paul's personal advice to his buddies Timothy and Titus to being this incredible window into the struggles and the evolution of the early church right after the apostles were gone. It leaves us to wonder, what does authorship really mean for text authority? And that's a question worth thinking about.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into something pretty wild. A startling literary echo between two ancient texts that could not be more different. We're talking about a parallel that connects a story of divine sacrifice with one of cynical, worldly satire.
So let's just start with a puzzle. I mean, on the one hand, you have the passion narrative of Jesus Christ, and on the other, you have this fragmented, hilarious, and often obscene Roman novel called the Satyricon. You'd think they have nothing in common, right? But deep down, they share this blueprint that's just too spot on to be an accident. So you've got the Gospel of Mark, a cornerstone of Christian faith, all about the crucifixion and resurrection. And then there's the Satyricon, a story famous for its dark humor and, let's just say, its very earthly desires. Looks like two totally different universes, right? Well, let's see about that.
All right, to crack this thing open, we've got to zoom in on a famous story inside the Satyricon. It's a short tale told by one of the characters about a woman known as the widow of Ephesus. So, the story kicks off with this widow. She's so famous for her virtue and her loyalty to her dead husband that she literally locks herself in his tomb, planning to just waste away right next to his corpse. She's the absolute picture of fidelity. Or so it seems.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Because when you put the widow's story right next to the passion narrative from Mark, some super specific, kind of weird similarities just jump right out at you.
So the first big parallel, it's the setting. The actual physical stage where all this drama goes down is almost identical in both stories.
Yeah, check this out. It's all about the shared location. In Mark, Jesus is crucified and then buried in a tomb right nearby. And in the Satyricon, some criminals are crucified, you guessed it, right near the vault where the widow is. So in both stories, the place of execution is literally right next to the place of burial. That creates a very specific kind of stage, doesn't it? Okay, so the setting is one thing, but what's really wild is how both stories bring in Roman authority to control the dead. We're not just talking about anybody here. We're talking about a body that's under official lockdown. I mean, just look at this. You've got a Roman soldier on the scene in both stories. In Mark, a centurion is there at the cross to make sure Jesus is dead. In the Satyricon, a soldier is explicitly told to guard the crucified bodies to make sure nobody, well, steals them for a proper burial. This Roman guard thing, that's another huge piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so we've got the stage, we've got the guard, and that brings us to the real kicker. Maybe the most shocking parallel of them all. A body goes missing.
Think about it. In both tales, a body just disappears, right under the nose of a guard. In the Gospels, right, the empty tomb leads to this whole accusation that the disciples stole Jesus' body. And get this, in the Satyricon, the parents of a criminal do exactly that. They steal his body from the cross while the guard is, occupied. Petronius' story literally acts out the very smear campaign that was used against the early Christians. It's uncanny.
Okay, so far the building blocks are lining up almost one for one. A tomb next to a cross, a Roman guard, a stolen body. But this is where the author, Petronius, just flips the script and delivers the punchline.
So you see, he's not just copying the story. The key here is that Petronius uses all these same ingredients to cook up something totally different. A dark, super cynical, and honestly kind of funny inversion of the whole resurrection story. He turns it completely inside out.
So let's just quickly remember how the Gospel of Mark works. It's a straight line, right? The body goes from the cross into the tomb. Then the tomb is found empty, and that signals resurrection, new life, the whole deal.
But in the Satyricon, the whole thing happens in reverse and for a shockingly practical reason. The guard, right, he's now facing death for losing that criminal's body. So, to save him, what does the widow do? She takes her own dead husband's corpse out of his coffin, hauls it out of the tomb, and nails it to the empty cross as a stand-in. Wow!
And why? Well, here's her reasoning. This is the woman who was supposedly the most faithful widow ever, and she says this to save her new boyfriend, the very guard she just met in the tomb. She's desecrating her husband's body not for some grand divine purpose, but for a very, very earthly one. It's like the ultimate act of profane, cynical problem-solving.
So, what in the world are we supposed to do with this? It's such a bizarre parallel, and this really gets to the big question. What does all this mean for how we read these ancient stories?
So, the big debate is, was Petronius actually making fun of the story of Jesus? Or were both of these writers just fishing from the same pond? A lot of scholars point to this idea, a kind of shared library of story ideas in the Greco-Roman world. Things like empty tombs, heroes disappearing without a trace. These were common tricks of the trade for storytellers back then.
And that's why this is still a hot topic for scholars. I mean, you've got a few different camps. Some are convinced the Satyricon is a direct, sharp parody of the Christian story. Others think, nah, it's just a dark comedy using the popular cliches of the time. And then there's the third idea, that maybe it's not about one influencing the other at all, but just proof that two very different authors were tapping into the same cultural zeitgeist.
And this is where you really see the different goals. Mark uses irony to point to a divine truth, right? When the centurion mocks Jesus as the Son of God, we, the audience, know he's accidentally speaking the absolute truth. But Petronius? He's using what you'd call gallows humor to expose just how hypocritical people can be. The faithful widow's actions are this deeply cynical joke about the canyon between who we pretend to be and what we're willing to do.
So in the end, whether this parallel is a deliberate parody or just a wild coincidence, it leaves us with a really fascinating question. It just goes to show how the exact same story elements, a tomb, a cross, a missing body, can be used to build two completely opposite narratives. One is a story of ultimate salvation, and the other is a story of ultimate cynicism. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How stories are born, how they're borrowed, and how they can be reborn into something completely new.
We all think we know the story of the empty tomb. But what if I told you that the very first explanation for it, this idea of a stolen body, wasn't just a rumor, but a plotline that was already playing out in the cynical, darkly funny literature of the Roman Empire?
This one sentence, right here, from the Gospel of Matthew itself. This is the heart of the whole mystery. In the Bible, it's presented as a lie, a total cover-up. But that story, that idea, it took on a life of its own. And it makes you wonder, where did this concept of a stolen Messiah actually come from?
That's right. The Gospel of Matthew isn't just telling us the story of the resurrection. At the very same time, it's actively arguing against a competing story. It's like a battle of narratives, one of a miracle and the other of a simple, very human theft. And that conflict is baked right into the text from the very beginning. Okay, so to really get what's going on, we have to look at the other story first. The counter-narrative that Matthew felt was so important, so threatening, that he had to address it head-on. This wasn't some minor detail. It was a huge deal in the ancient world.
So if you remember the account in Matthew, it's very specific. The authorities are genuinely worried that the disciples will try to fake a resurrection by snatching the body, so they post a Roman guard. But then an angel shows up, the guards are completely terrified, the tomb is open, and the crucial part is what happens right after. The authorities literally pay the guards to spread a very specific story: the disciples stole the body while we were all asleep.
And this wasn't just some hypothetical worry. Fast forward about a century, and you have an early Christian writer, Justin Martyr, who confirms that this exact story, that the disciples stole the body, was still being actively spread among Jewish communities. This tells us the rumor was a real, significant counter-narrative that early Christians were constantly up against.
Okay, now here is where it gets really, really interesting. What if this whole story of a stolen body wasn't just a rumor, but a kind of familiar plot device? What if a popular, cynical Roman satire contained a story that looks almost identical to the very thing Matthew was trying to debunk?
So for that, we have to step into a totally different world. We're leaving the sacred texts behind and jumping into the profane, with a Roman novel called the Satyricon. It was written by Petronius, a satirist in the court of Emperor Nero, and it is famous for its gallows humor and its pretty cynical take on Roman life.
So in this story from Petronius, we find a soldier, and his job is to guard crucified criminals. The text tells us exactly why, lest any might be taken from the cross and buried. So right away you have a guard, you have a body, and you have the explicit threat of theft. You can already see the parallels starting to take shape, right?
So here's the plot in a nutshell. A soldier's on guard duty. He spots a beautiful widow in a tomb nearby and gets distracted. They start an affair. While his attention is elsewhere, the family of one of the crucified men grabs their chance, takes their son's body down from the cross, and buries it. And just like that, the soldier has failed his duty and is now facing execution.
Okay, so let's put these two stories side by side.
because when you actually break them down, the parallels between the story Matthew is trying to refute and the story Petronius just casually tells, well, they're absolutely startling. First up, the basic setup. In Matthew, you've got Roman soldiers guarding a body in a tomb, specifically to stop it from being stolen. In the Satyricon, you've got a Roman soldier guarding bodies on crosses for the exact same reason, to prevent theft for burial. It's the same job description.
And then you've got the negligent guard. In the rumor that Matthew reports, the guards fell asleep. In Petronius' story, the guard is negligent because he's, well, let's just say he's otherwise occupied with the widow. Either way, it's a lapse in duty that directly leads to a body going missing.
And this is the punchline. The story that Matthew presents as a flat-out lie, a body being stolen by devoted followers while the guard isn't paying attention, is exactly what happens in the Satyricon. The Roman satire basically acts out step for step the very rumor that the gospel is trying so hard to put to rest.
But it doesn't stop there. The way Petronius' story ends is where things take a truly shocking and kind of grotesque turn. It basically becomes a darkly comic inversion of the Christian narrative, twisting every single sacred element.
So, to save her new lover, the soldier, from being executed, the widow comes up with a solution. It's grim. She offers up the body of her own dead husband to be a replacement for the stolen criminal. She actually says she'd rather hang up her dead husband than see her living lover die.
And here, that inversion becomes crystal clear. In the Christian story, a body is taken down from a cross, put in a tomb, and it leads to resurrection and the salvation of the world. In the Satyricon, a body is taken out of a tomb and put on a cross, and it stays dead, just a substitute to save one guy's skin. It's a total, cynical reversal of the sacred logic.
The satire even ends with a little parody of the public's reaction. The next day, the townspeople are just baffled, wondering how on earth a dead body got onto a cross. This public confusion and wonder is like a cynical, dark echo of the awe and mystery surrounding the empty tomb in the Christian story.
So, what is going on here? How do you explain these absolutely stunning parallels? Was Petronius reading an early Christian text and just decided to mock it? Or is it something else entirely? Well, scholars basically have two main theories about this.
The first theory is that this is no accident at all. The argument is that Petronius was writing a deliberate anti-Christian satire. Maybe he heard these new stories about a crucified Messiah whose body vanished, and he crafted this cynical, all-too-human story to explain it away. You don't need a miracle, just a negligent guard, a grieving family, and a horny widow. It's a completely worldly explanation for a supernatural claim.
Now, the second theory is a bit more complex. It suggests that maybe both writers, Matthew and Petronius, were just products of their time. They were both drawing from a shared cultural toolkit of popular story ideas. Apparently, tales of faked deaths, grave robberies, and empty tombs that get mistaken for resurrections were actually common themes in the popular romance novels of the day. So, in this view, they weren't copying each other, they were just using the same popular ingredients to tell two very different kinds of stories.
In the end, whether it's a direct parody or just a shared cultural echo, you can't deny the parallel is there. It really shows how the same basic plot, a guarded body, a shocking disappearance, and a public mystery can be used to build a story of transcendent, world-changing faith, or a cynical joke about human foolishness. It really all just depends on who's telling the story.
You know, when we think about early Christianity, we often picture this single, unified faith, right? But the reality? Oh, it was way more complex, and honestly, a lot more contentious. In those first couple of centuries, Christianity was this vibrant, kind of chaotic landscape of competing ideas, all fighting to define what faith even meant. Okay, let's dive into this battle for belief.
Now, get this. This isn't a criticism coming from some outsider. This is an accusation from inside the New Testament itself. The author, writing in the name of the Apostle Paul, is calling out fellow Christians for a belief he sees as so dangerous it could wreck the whole foundation of the faith. I mean, how could anyone claim the resurrection had already happened? This wasn't some minor disagreement. This was the fault line of a massive theological earthquake. And to understand it, we've got to look at the two sides that were clashing for the very soul of this new religion. So, on one side, you have the tradition that would eventually become mainstream Christianity, what scholars call the proto-Orthodox faith.
And on the other side, a whole diverse array of spiritual movements that we now kind of lump together under the name Gnosticism. These weren't just two different denominations. We're talking about two fundamentally different ways of seeing the entire world.
The Proto-Orthodox view, which you see laid out in books like 1st and 2nd Timothy, was all about a future hope, the goodness of the physical world, and why a structured church was so important. The Gnostics, though, they were focused on something completely different, a secret divine knowledge that could give you salvation right now, letting your spirit escape what they saw as the prison of the material world. And that huge difference in worldview? That's what brings us to our first major flashpoint. All right, let's get back to that startling claim that the resurrection was already past. To the Proto-Orthodox folks, this was just complete nonsense. But for the Gnostics, it was the whole point. And it all hinged on one key concept. That key concept is gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge. But for these groups, it wasn't about book smarts. It was this profound, mystical awakening, a moment of gnosis where you suddenly realized your true spiritual self was a divine spark that had gotten trapped inside a decaying body. And this just lays the conflict bare. For the Gnostics, the resurrection was that spiritual awakening. The second you received that gnosis, it happened. Your spirit had already risen from the death of the material world. But the pastoral epistles pushed back, and they pushed back hard. They insisted the resurrection was a future physical event where your actual body would be redeemed because creation itself was good. And we're not just guessing here. We have writings from these groups that confirm this exact view. The Gnostic Gospel of Philip says it flat out. Waiting for a resurrection after you die is a mistake. The real resurrection, the only one that actually matters, has to happen while you're alive. This wasn't just a different timeline. It was a completely different understanding of salvation, the body, and the world itself. This leads us right into the second battlefront. This radical disagreement over whether the physical world was a divine creation or maybe just a cosmic mistake. You see, at the heart of many of these Gnostic systems was a really stark dualism. The world of the spirit, pure, good, created by a perfect God. But the material world, they saw it as this flawed, even evil creation, made by a lesser, ignorant deity. Your body wasn't a gift, it was a cage.
And a belief like that has real-world consequences. The author of 1 Timothy is warning about teachers who are forbidding marriage and telling their followers to abstain from certain foods. And why? Well, if you believe matter is evil, then it makes sense that you should reject the things that create more of it. This link between theology and praxis is just fascinating. You had groups known as Encratites, who were influenced by thinkers like Marcion, and they saw marriage, which leads to procreation and trapping more spirits in flesh, as fundamentally corrupt. The response from the pastoral author is fierce. He says this isn't piety. It's a demonic doctrine that basically insults God, who created everything to be good. Now, the author of the pastorals didn't just disagree with Gnostic ideas. He framed them as a dangerous contagion. This wasn't an intellectual debate for him. It was a matter of public health for the church. It's a dynamic we still see today, right? When certain ideas get labeled as toxic or unhealthy. This is the actual word used in 2 Timothy to describe the teachings of those who claimed the resurrection was already past. Not a mistake, not a wrong opinion, a gangrene, a disease that literally eats away at living flesh and spreads. This medical language is a totally deliberate strategy. The pastorals are constantly talking about their own teachings as sound or healthy doctrine. The original Greek is hygienousa didaskalia, which is actually where we get our word hygiene. And in contrast, the Gnostic search for new knowledge gets painted as a sickness. It's a really powerful rhetorical move that reframes the whole conflict. You don't debate a disease, you quarantine it and you try to eradicate it. And right here, the author takes his most direct shot. The Greek word for knowledge in this verse is gnosis. He's telling his followers to avoid the contradictions of what is falsely called gnosis. I mean, that's a crystal clear dismissal of the entire foundation of his opponent's worldview. Okay, so if Gnostic ideas are a dangerous disease, how do you stop the infection from spreading? Well, for the pastorals, the answer was pretty simple. You build an immune system. You create order, structure, and really clear lines of authority. A really important word here is eusebeia, or godliness. Now, this word isn't just about personal piety. It's about proper public conduct, social stability, and respectability. It really shows a shift from a more charismatic movement to an established institution. And the emphasis on this is striking. The term eusebeia shows up 10 times in these 3 short letters. But in the undisputed letters of Paul, it's pretty much absent. This points to a new, urgent concern for creating a stable, well-ordered community that could stand against what they saw as the chaos of Gnostic individualism. This concern for order becomes really concrete in the church hierarchy that the pastorals describe. Unlike the earlier, more free-form communities, here we see these defined roles with specific qualifications: bishops, elders, and deacons. This whole structure was designed to be the guardian of healthy doctrine, the firewall against heresy. And ultimately, the vision laid out in the pastoral epistles won. The belief in a future, physical resurrection, the affirmation that creation is good, and a hierarchical church structure. These became the cornerstones of what we now know as mainstream Orthodox Christianity. And this whole story leaves us with a really provocative question, doesn't it? This ancient battle for belief raises a timeless issue. In any system of thought, whether it's religious or secular, who gets to draw that line? Who holds the authority to decide what counts as healthy truth versus what is a dangerous sickness of ideas? It's a question they were fighting over back then, and frankly, one we're still wrestling with today.
What if some of the most influential letters in the New Testament weren't actually written by who we think they were? Let's dive into one of early Christianity's most fascinating literary mysteries. So here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to put on our detective hats. First, we'll lay out the puzzle itself. Then, we'll zero in on a prime suspect. After that, we'll examine the verbal fingerprints they left behind and their potential agenda, before, bringing in a digital detective to wrap things up.
All right, so our whole investigation kicks off with a few key documents right at the heart of the Christian tradition, the letters to Timothy and Titus. Now, people often call them the pastoral epistles. Why? Because they're written to pastors, or you could say shepherds, of these early church communities, giving them the lowdown on how to lead. We're talking about 3 short but really personal and authoritative letters. They're packed with instructions on church leadership, some pretty stark warnings against false teachings, and a lot of personal encouragement.
And for centuries, literally centuries, everyone just accepted that they were written by the Apostle Paul kind of late in his life to his most trusted guys on the ground. That's the story that's been passed down.
Yeah, what if it's not that simple? For more than 100 years now, scholars have been raising some serious red flags. The language, the style, the historical setting, something about it all just doesn't quite line up with the Paul we think we know from all his other letters.
Okay, so the thing to get here is that the case against Paul isn't just based on one little thing. It's a whole pile of evidence. We've got this vocabulary and a really formal style that feels, just different from the fiery, sometimes chaotic energy you get in letters like Galatians or Corinthians. And on top of that, these letters lay out a church with this really specific formal hierarchy. You've got your bishops, your elders, your deacons, and that whole setup feels way more developed than the more free-flowing, charismatic communities Paul was starting a whole generation earlier.
So if the evidence is pointing away from Paul, it has to be pointing somewhere, right? And that brings us to this really important figure from the very next generation of Christian leaders.
And that, right there, is the million-dollar question for investigation. If Paul didn't write these letters, who did? And maybe more importantly, why would they write them in his name?
Well, there's a really compelling theory that points to a man named Ignatius. He was the bishop of Antioch way back in the early 2nd century. He was a huge deal, a major church leader. And lucky for us, his own letters survived, which gives us something fascinating to compare.
Okay, so what's the motive? Why would a guy like Ignatius write under a fake name? The answer in one word is authority. By writing in Paul's name, he could basically give the apostles' giant stamp of approval to his own vision for the church. And that vision was all about a strong, top-down hierarchy led by a bishop, which he thought was the best way to fight what he saw as really dangerous heresies. Now, if this theory is right, it bumps the creation of these letters from the 60s CE all the way to the turn of the 2nd century. And now for the good stuff, the hard evidence. Every author has a kind of unique verbal fingerprint, and if we analyze the words themselves, we can uncover some pretty remarkable clues.
306. Just remember that number. That's how many words are used in the pastoral epistles that you just don't find anywhere in Paul's 7 undisputed letters. That's not just a small difference, that's a huge statistical anomaly.
And here's the real kicker.
These unique words aren't just random. They are the common language of Christian writers in the early 2nd century, which is exactly the time and place of our guy Ignatius of Antioch.
In this kind of textual analysis, these one-off words have a fancy name, hapax legomena. Now, having a few is totally normal, but when you see a big cluster of them, like we do in the pastorals, that's a major red flag for scholars. It really suggests a different person was holding the pen.
Let's get specific for a second. Take the word eusebia, which means godliness. It's all over the pastorals and Ignatius's letters, but you hardly ever see it in Paul's authentic work. Or the idea of hypomone, or endurance. It takes on this really specific, almost military flavor in both the pastorals and Ignatius. And maybe the biggest smoking gun of all is the term episkopos, or bishop. In Paul's letters, it's kind of a general mention, but in both the pastorals and Ignatius's writings, it's a fixed, top-tier office in a very detailed chain of command. The fingerprints, they're really starting to look like a match.
But the connections go way deeper than just a few words here and there. When you zoom out and look at the big picture, the main ideas, the things they're really worried about, it starts to look like the pastoral epistles and the letters of Ignatius were written in the exact same world.
And this, right here, is where you see the biggest difference. Paul's communities, they were fluid, kind of messy, led by the Spirit through all these different roles like prophets and teachers. But the world of the pastorals and Ignatius is all about structure. It's a top-down system with one single bishop calling the shots. This was a massive change, and it's a vision that both of these sources push for relentlessly. And it doesn't even stop there. Both are totally obsessed with guarding the deposit of sound doctrine. Both are constantly on a heresy hunt. And in both of them, the actual meaning of the word faith starts to change. It goes from meaning this radical trust in God to meaning the body of correct teachings you have to believe. It's like they're a perfect mirror image of each other's priorities.
Okay, for our final piece of evidence, we're going to pivot from ancient manuscripts to modern computers. There's this field called stylometrics, and it uses computational analysis to measure and compare writing styles with honestly incredible precision. So you'd think, right? The linguistic links are super strong, the shared agenda is undeniable, it really seems like we've found our guy. But this is where the story takes a really fascinating twist.
Yeah, our digital detective ends up making things a bit more complicated. It reveals a nuance that you'd probably miss just reading these texts side by side.
So check this out. The computer analysis confirms. Yep, the pastorals almost certainly were not written by Paul. But, and this is the wild part, it also finds that Ignatius's own letters are a better imitation of Paul's style than the pastorals are. What does that suggest? That Ignatius was a master at channeling Paul's voice when he wanted to. So, where does that leave us? It points to something called the same circle theory. Maybe the pastorals weren't written by Ignatius himself, but by someone in his crew, a close associate. Perhaps they were meant as more of a formal handbook for churches, or maybe even by his contemporary, another church leader named Polycarp of Smyrna.
So the real takeaway here isn't necessarily about pinning the crime on a single individual. The overwhelming evidence, the words, the theology, the computer data, it all places these letters firmly in one specific time and place. The world of early 2nd century Christianity in Asia Minor, a world that was grappling with heresy and trying to forge a new structure just to survive.
And that leaves us with a final and pretty provocative question to think about. This whole investigation, it's not just about who wrote what. It forces us to ask much bigger questions about how sacred texts even come to be, and how faith changes and adapts to face new challenges. It shows us that behind these ancient letters lies a really dynamic and very human story.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're grabbing our magnifying glasses and diving headfirst into a linguistic mystery buried deep inside the New Testament. We're about to investigate a set of ancient letters that are filled with these cryptic warnings. And by looking closely, we're going to uncover an entire ideological war that was fought not with swords, but with words. Okay, let's dive right in. Our entire investigation is going to center on 3 specific books in the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. You'll often hear these 3 referred to as the pastoral epistles. Now, traditionally, these letters are said to have been written by the Apostle Paul, though, a lot of modern scholars actually debate that. But for what we're doing today, think of these letters as our case file. They are packed with these urgent warnings about a dangerous false teaching. And here's the cool part. The specific words the author uses, those are the fingerprints we're going to use to figure out who the bad guy is. So let's get to our first and, honestly, our most direct piece of evidence. It's a critical phrase that comes from that first letter to Timothy. The author gives this really stark command, right? He says, to avoid the contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. That last little bit, that's the key. And to really get why it's so important, we have to look at the original Greek word. Okay, so the Greek word here is gnosis. Now, gnosis does mean knowledge, but we're not talking about, knowing facts for a test. In this context, gnosis refers to a special, secret, almost mystical kind of spiritual insight that some people believed was absolutely essential to be saved. And this right here just illustrates that connection perfectly. The word Gnostic wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It comes directly from that Greek word, gnosis. So whenever you hear the term Gnostic, you can literally just think of them as the people who are all about the knowledge. So here's the crucial point. By specifically attacking falsely called gnosis, the author isn't being subtle at all. He is taking a direct shot at the absolute core idea of the people we call the Gnostics. Okay, now this next clue is where things get really, really interesting. This is how a single specific word can help us narrow down our search from this big, broad movement to the ideas of one very specific and very influential person. So let's go back to that same verse, 1 Timothy 6:20. It doesn't just warn against false knowledge, right? It also tells Timothy to avoid contradictions. Well, the Greek word for contradictions is antithesis. And that very specific word, antithesis, it's like a giant flashing arrow pointing us directly to this major figure from the 2nd century named Marcion of Sinope. Marcion was pushing some seriously radical ideas. His main thing was that the God from the Old Testament was a totally different, kind of wrathful, lesser being than the loving Father of Jesus Christ. And here it is. This is the linguistic bullseye, Marcion's most famous work, the text where he laid out all these passages from the Old and New Testaments to prove how much they contradicted each other. What did he title it? He called it the antitheses. I mean, come on, that is not a coincidence. It's a direct linguistic hit on the warning in the letter. All right, let's move on to our third clue. This one is really going to help us build a more detailed picture of what these Gnostic teachers were actually saying and why the author of the Pastorals was so concerned. So earlier in that same letter, the author issues another warning. This time, he's telling his followers not to waste their time with myths and endless genealogies. Now, you might hear endless genealogies and think he's just warning people not to get lost in their family tree on some website. But no. This is actually a very specific jab at the Gnostic super complex and frankly kind of bizarre view of how the universe works. You see, Gnostics taught that our whole physical world was basically a cosmic accident. They believed that from a true, perfect God, a whole series of divine beings, which they called aeons, sort of flowed out, creating this kind of divine family tree. A big mistake by the last of these aeons, a being named Sophia, led to the creation of a flawed, lesser god. And that god is the one who created our imperfect material world. Those were the endless genealogies the author was fighting against. So you're faced with this incredibly complex Gnostic system. What do you do? Well, the author of the Pastorals didn't just go on the attack. They also played defense. They built what you could call a linguistic firewall. And they did it by changing the very meaning of key religious words. So let's take the word faith. That's pistis in Greek. In the letters we're sure Paul wrote, it almost always means this personal, trusting acceptance of Christ. It's an action. But here, in the Pastorals, it shifts. It becomes the faith, a solid, defined body of teaching. It's not just something you do, it's something you guard. It's a creed. And you see the exact same thing happen with a word like righteous. For Paul, that's a big theological idea. It's about a person's legal standing before God. But in the Pastorals, its meaning gets a lot more down to earth. It just means being a good, upright, moral person. This shift was a brilliant move because it put the focus back on good behavior, directly countering the Gnostics who prize secret knowledge above all else. Okay, so when we put all of this linguistic evidence together, I'm talking the direct hits, the specific name drops, the clever defensive wordplay, the verdict becomes pretty darn clear. The linguistic fingerprints are just everywhere. You have the direct shot at gnosis,
You have the very specific reference to antitheses. You've got the critique of endless genealogies, and then this redefinition of core terms. It all paints a picture of the pastoral epistles as this carefully constructed playbook for how to identify and fight back against the teachings of early Gnosticism.
And that really just leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? This ancient text is a powerful reminder that some of history's greatest and most important conflicts weren't fought with swords and shields, but with sentences and definitions. The words we choose to use and the meanings we give them, they have the power to define reality itself and shape the future. You know, the Apostle Paul. For billions of people, he's one of the absolute pillars of faith. But what if I told you that in the century right after his death, he was the single most controversial, most dangerous, and most valuable figure in all of early Christianity? His legacy was completely up for grabs, and whoever could claim him, well, they would get to define the future of the faith itself.
So let's just dive right into it. This whole battle for Paul's soul forces us to ask a really critical question. Who was he really? And, you know, the answer isn't as simple as just cracking open his letters. Because, as we're about to see, the collection of writings under his name might just be the evidence of the battle itself.
So, when scholars look at the letters attributed to Paul, they see two completely different voices. It's almost uncanny. On one hand, you have the undisputed letters, the ones everyone agrees he actually wrote. In those, he is raw, he's passionate, he's urgent, expecting the world to end any second. But then you look at the other letters, the ones some scholars question, and he's different. He's a calm teacher, a methodical administrator building an institution that's meant to last. This huge contrast, that's the heart of the battle for his legacy. And it all kicked off with a major fight. All right, so our first contender in this theological brawl was a very wealthy 2nd century ship owner named Marcion. He shows up in Rome with this totally radical and, to a lot of people, a completely horrifying idea about God, the Bible, and most importantly, about Paul. His vision, if it had won, would have created a version of Christianity we would barely recognize today. Marcion's theology was nothing short of an earthquake. He basically argued that the angry, jealous, law-given God of the Old Testament was a totally different and, frankly, inferior being than the loving, merciful Father that Jesus talked about. So for Marcion, Christianity wasn't the fulfillment of Judaism, oh no, it was a complete and total break from it. And to prove his point, Marcion did something revolutionary. He created the very first New Testament. He tossed out the entire Hebrew Bible. He kept only one gospel, a heavily edited version of Luke, and 10 of Paul's letters. And then, and this is the wild part, he took a surgeon's scalpel to them. He cut out every single positive reference to Jewish law, the prophets, or that creator God. In Marcion's Bible, Paul became the star witness for Christianity completely severed from its Jewish roots. Okay, so that's one camp trying to claim Paul. At the exact same time, you have another set of movements. We lump them together today and call them Gnosticism, and they wanted Paul too. But they saw him very differently. He wasn't some anti-Jewish theologian. For them, Paul was a mystical guru, someone who held the keys to secret wisdom. So the key idea here is gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge. Gnostics generally believed that the physical world was a kind of prison created by a lesser, flawed God. And the only way to escape was to receive secret, divine knowledge, gnosis, from a messenger from the true higher God. They read Paul's letters not as straightforward theology, but as coded texts packed with hidden clues to this secret wisdom. Now you can imagine the emerging mainstream church saw this as a massive threat. And you can literally see their counterattack in the texts themselves. A letter written in Paul's name, 1 Timothy, takes a direct shot. When it says to ignore myths and endless genealogies, it's not being vague. It's targeting the incredibly complex Gnostic creation stories, which were full of divine beings and cosmic family trees. And they didn't stop there. This is just a masterful piece of what you could call terminological warfare. The author literally takes the Gnostics' favorite word, gnosis, and flips it on them, dismissing it as falsely called knowledge. It's a brilliant, powerful way of using Paul's authority to just completely pull the rug out from under their entire belief system. So, with Marcion on one side and the Gnostics on the other, the groups that would eventually become mainstream Christianity, what scholars call proto-Orthodox, had to fight back. They absolutely had to reclaim Paul, because if they lost him, they they would lose control of Christianity's future. And they did it with two incredibly clever literary strategies. Their first big move was basically to write Paul's official biography. The book of Acts presents a very specific picture of Paul. He's a law-abiding Jew, he respects the original apostles in Jerusalem, and he sees Christianity as the natural fulfillment of everything in the Hebrew Scriptures. It was a direct narrative takedown of Marcion's radical, anti-Jewish version of Paul. And what's amazing is that modern analysis of the writing style totally backs this up. There's this technique called stylometric analysis. Think of it like a statistical fingerprint for an author's style. And it shows that Acts has this unique, formal, almost legalistic style of Greek. And its constant, repeated references to Jewish history make it a perfect literary weapon, stylistically engineered to hammer home Jewish-Christian continuity and refute Marcion point by point. The second strategy was even bolder. They wrote new letters in Paul's name, the books we now call 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And these letters present a new Paul, one who is deeply, deeply concerned with establishing church order, fighting heresy, and passing down the correct tradition. This wasn't the fiery, apocalyptic prophet. This was an institution builder, a CEO. But look, to make this new institutional Paul believable, the authors needed to get the voice right. And they found it, not in the fiery, chaotic letters of the real Paul, but in the calm, measured, and highly respected writings of the Roman Stoic philosophers. Yeah, they borrowed this popular Greco-Roman genre called protreptic rhetoric. See, famous Stoics like Seneca would do this all the time. He'd write these seemingly private letters of advice to a student, but they were actually meant for a huge public audience. By using this exact same style for the letters to Timothy and Titus, the authors gave their Paul a powerful new persona, the calm, wise philosopher-teacher, whose authority felt measured, traditional, and absolute. And this slide just perfectly illustrates the result of that shift. Paul's original churches were dynamic, sometimes messy, charismatic groups led by the Spirit. Different people had different gifts, like prophecy or teaching. But the churches you see in these later letters, they are completely different. They have a rigid, top-down structure with bishops and deacons. Authority doesn't come from a spontaneous gift of the Spirit anymore. It comes from an appointed office. And this move towards institutionalization is just perfectly captured by this quote from the early church father Ignatius of Antioch. Pay attention to the bishop. That's the new mission statement. Obedience to a single leader. Those unpredictable, charismatic movements were being pushed to the side in favor of order, structure, and a clear chain of command. All things you need if you want your institution to survive for the long haul. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? It's that the Apostle Paul we have in the New Testament isn't some simple, single figure. He's a composite character. His final form was forged in the fire of these intense theological battles over the very soul of Christianity. The Paul we've inherited carries the echoes of all these conflicts. He's the product of this huge fight between Marcion's radical Paul, the Gnostics' mystical Paul, and, of course, the proto-Orthodox counterpunch that created the organized, institution-building Paul. Ultimately, the battle for Paul's soul was won by the institution builders. The wild Paul, that raw, urgent, apocalyptic prophet from the undisputed letters, he was reframed, reinterpreted, and even supplemented with new writings that essentially made him safe for a growing, organized church that needed structure to survive. And that just leaves us with one final, and I think pretty provocative question. This whole process of taming Paul was probably essential for the survival and growth of the church as we know it today. But by making him orthodox, by making him safe, you have to wonder, what parts of his original radical vision might have been lost along the way?
All right, let's get into it. You know, buried deep inside the New Testament, there's a mystery that's almost 2,000 years old. It's this incredible case of, theological espionage, a real battle for the soul of an apostle. And right at the heart of it all is this cryptic warning that seems to point a finger at one of the most controversial figures in all of early Christian history. So today, we're opening up the case file.
Okay, so here it is. This is our central clue, and it comes from a letter written in the name of the Apostle Paul. It's a direct order to a young church leader named Timothy. He's being told to steer clear of contradictions and something falsely called knowledge. Now, at first glance, that might sound kind of vague, right? But for historians, these are like super specific breadcrumbs leading us down a very interesting trail.
So the big question is, who exactly were these opponents? You know, the ones spreading this so-called false knowledge. Who was the author trying to shut down? To figure that out, we've got to hop in our time machine, travel to the 2nd century, and meet our prime suspect.
So meet Marcion of Sinope. And listen, this guy was no small-time player. He was a hugely influential and powerful leader, and his ideas sent absolute shockwaves through the early church. In fact, he pretty much forced them to figure out what it was they actually believed.
Marcion was not your average theologian. He was a rich shipowner who sailed into Rome with this totally radical message. He said that the angry, law-giving God of the Old Testament was actually an inferior creator God and was a completely separate being from the loving, good Father that Jesus talked about. He was so all in on this idea that he created his very own Bible, which was basically a hand-picked collection of Paul's letters and his own version of the Gospel of Luke.
The core of his whole system was this idea of dualism. But for Marcion, it wasn't just, a simple battle between good and evil. It was God versus God. On one side, you had the God of Israel, who created the physical world, a world Marcion saw as seriously flawed. And on the other side, you had this superior, previously unknown God of pure love and mercy, who sent Jesus to save us from that other creator God.
Now, this whole two gods idea had some major real-world consequences. To basically give the middle finger to the creator God in his physical world, Marcion's followers lived this super strict lifestyle. It's called asceticism. They rejected marriage because why would you want to create more physical bodies for the lesser god's world? And they wouldn't eat meat. Now, hang on to that detail because it's going to be a huge piece of evidence later on.
Okay, so we've got our suspect profile on Marcion. Now let's see how it lines up with that warning we saw in 1 Timothy. And believe me, this is where the case gets really interesting.
Every good detective story needs a smoking gun, right? Well, in this ancient text, we might just have one, and it's hidden in a single, very unusual Greek word.
This connection is just wow. The letter to Timothy warns against something called antitheses, which means contradictions. And it just so happens that the title of Marcion's most famous book, his masterpiece, was The Antitheses. I mean, what are the odds of that being a coincidence? They're practically zero. This is the kind of direct hit that makes scholars literally sit up and pay attention.
So what exactly was in Marcion's book, The Antitheses? Well, one of his biggest critics, a church father named Tertullian, spelled it out for us. He said Marcion would put passages from the Old and New Testaments right next to each other to highlight all the ways they contradicted each other. His whole goal was to prove they came from two completely different gods. It was his Exhibit A.
And the evidence just keeps piling up. Remember that whole asceticism thing? Well, check this out. Another passage in 1 Timothy specifically calls out teachers who forbid marriage and enjoin abstinence from foods. That is a perfect one-to-one match for what Marcion's followers did. The letter also goes out of its way to say that the material world is good, which is a direct shot at Marcion's core belief that it was the junk work of a lesser god. The profile just fits him like a glove.
But this story gets even bigger. This wasn't just about shutting down one controversial teacher. The evidence suggests there was a much higher stakes game being played here, a battle for the legacy of the Apostle Paul himself.
See, Marcion absolutely loved Paul. He thought Paul was the only apostle who really got what Jesus was all about. So he put together the very first collection of Paul's writings, which he called the Apostolaticon. But here's the kicker. The three letters that seemed to be targeting him, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, were mysteriously missing from his collection.
And that was no accident. This has led scholars to a pretty explosive theory, that these letters, the so-called pastoral epistles, were actually written in response to Marcion. The goal was to basically wrestle Paul's authority back from him, to create a more organized, tamed Paul that fit with the structure of the mainstream church. It was a strategic move to counter Marcion's wild, radical version of the apostle.
So the evidence seems pretty airtight, doesn't it? We have a linguistic smoking gun, a perfect theological profile, and a clear motive. But, like any good mystery, there's one last twist in the tale.
Yeah, just when we think we have the case all wrapped up, a piece of counter-evidence pops up that throws a massive wrench in the works and really complicates our nice, neat little conclusion.
Okay, so here's the big problem. While some parts of these letters fit Marcion perfectly, other parts don't fit him at all. The letters say the opponents are obsessed with Jewish myths, genealogies, and being teachers of the law. And that is the absolute polar opposite of Marcion. This is a guy who wanted nothing to do with Judaism or the Old Testament. He built his entire system on throwing it all out.
So because of this huge discrepancy, a lot of scholars now think the original person in the crosshairs wasn't Marcion at all. It was probably a totally different group, most likely some kind of hybrid movement that mixed early Gnostic ideas with Jewish legal traditions.
So, what's the final verdict in our biblical whodunit? Well, it's a bit messy. Marcion probably wasn't the guy the author was originally aiming for. But in a way, that almost doesn't matter. The parallels were just too strong, and Marcion's movement was too big to ignore. So these letters became the Proto-Orthodox Church's weapon of choice. They were the perfect tool to fight back, to rescue Paul from the so-called heretics, and to set the course for what would become mainstream Christianity.
And that really leaves us with a fascinating question to chew on. This ancient fight over who owned Paul's legacy literally shaped the Bible we hold in our hands today. It just makes you wonder, what would Christianity even look like if Marcion had won? What if his version of a wild, untamed Paul, completely cut off from his Jewish roots, had become the one everyone followed? It's a heck of a question, and it's a great reminder that history is never quite as set in stone as we think.
Ever read something and get the feeling there's a secret message hiding just under the surface? You know, like a hidden code? Well, it turns out that some ancient texts, and yeah, that includes parts of the New Testament, are absolutely packed with these kinds of coded warnings. They were targeting specific ideas and rival groups in a really high-stakes battle for what to believe. And today, we're going to crack that code. Okay, so our investigation kicks off with this really strange instruction from a letter we call 1 Timothy. The author is telling his reader to avoid something super specific, the contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. Now, this isn't just, a vague warning against being wrong. This is targeted. This is precise. And that's the big question, right? What knowledge was so dangerous that it had to be called out like this? What were these contradictions he was talking about? Answering this is going to take us on a bit of a linguistic detective story, and we'll peel back the layers on a conflict that literally shaped the future of Christianity. So, we're going to act as investigators here, decoding these ancient phrases. Each one is a clue. And when we put them all together, they reveal this hidden war of words that was fought, not with swords, but with vocabulary itself. All right, our first clue comes when we look at the original Greek. The phrase, falsely called knowledge, is pseudonymous gnosis. And that last word, gnosis, well, that's the key that's going to unlock this whole mystery. So gnosis is just the Greek word for, well, knowledge. But in the 2nd century, that word became tied to this really powerful religious movement, Gnosticism. The Gnostics believed that you weren't saved through faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. No, for them, salvation came from getting this secret, divine gnosis that would awaken the little spark of God that was trapped inside of you. And here's the thing, this isn't just a theory. A few decades after this letter was written, a famous bishop named Irenaeus wrote this massive takedown of Gnosticism. And what did he title his 5-volume book? He literally lifted the exact phrase from 1 Timothy on the exposure and refutation of their falsely called gnosis. I mean, talk about a smoking gun. The code is cracked. The warning was absolutely 100% aimed at the Gnostics. But hold on, because that same verse has another clue tucked inside. Let's look at the other key term in that warning, and you'll see how this whole thing just gets deeper. The author warns against contradictions, or in the Greek, antitheses. Now, on its own, it just means opposing arguments. But in the world of the 2nd century, this word was explosive. It pointed right at one of the most famous, or infamous, heretics in all of early Christianity. This warning had a specific bullseye on a guy named Marcion, and he wrote a hugely influential book called, you guessed it, Antithesis. What he did was he'd put a quote from the Old Testament right next to a quote from the New Testament to prove they were talking about two different gods. His goal was to show that the angry creator God of the Old Testament was a totally separate, lesser being than the loving, merciful God that Jesus revealed. That's a dualistic idea, which was right at home in a lot of Gnostic thinking. So the warning against antithesis was a direct shot at Marcion's most important book. But this whole conflict wasn't just about books, not at all. It was a fundamental clash over the nature of reality itself. It was a war of entire worldviews. So let's look at our next set of clues. The author keeps telling people not to get tangled up in myths and endless genealogies. And again, that just sounds so specific. I mean, what kind of genealogies could possibly be a threat to a religion? Well, it all makes perfect sense when you look at the Gnostic creation story.
They believed that from the one true ultimate God, a whole series of lesser divine beings called eons came pouring out in pairs. It created this incredibly complex, sprawling family tree of gods, a divine genealogy. That's what the author was dismissing as endless genealogies. It was a direct slam on the very structure of the Gnostic universe.
The battle also got really heated over the idea of the resurrection. In another letter to Timothy, the author calls out two guys by name for teaching that the resurrection has already taken place. This might sound like a tiny theological disagreement, but it was a direct hit on the very heart of Christian hope. You see, the view in these letters was that believers would have a physical, bodily resurrection in the future. But the Gnostics, they saw the body as an evil prison for your spirit. So for them, the real resurrection wasn't something in the future. It was a spiritual event that happens right now, in this life. It was that moment you received gnosis, and your spirit woke up from the prison of your own body. And we don't even have to guess about this. We have actual Gnostic texts that say this exact thing. The Gnostic Treatise on Resurrection, which was discovered in Egypt, straight up says, already you have the resurrection. It's proof positive that the heresy being condemned in 2 Timothy was a core Gnostic belief. This all came from a radical dualism at the center of Gnosticism. They taught that the physical world, including our bodies, was basically a cosmic mistake, created by a lesser, ignorant, or maybe even evil god. So if the body is a prison, then things that keep the physical world going, like marriage and having kids, are bad. They just trap more divine spirits in the muck of the material world. And that's why some of these groups forbade marriage and had strict rules about what you could eat.
And what was the biblical author's response to that? A direct, forceful counterpunch. He declares that everything created by God is good. It's a clear, powerful defense of the goodness of the Creator God and the physical world itself, pushing back hard against the Gnostic view that it's all just fundamentally evil. But the author didn't just play defense. He also went on the offense, basically building a linguistic fortress to draw a really clear line in the sand between his community and everyone else. Take the word faith, or pistis in Greek. For the Apostle Paul, faith was this dynamic, active, personal trust in Christ. But in these pastoral letters, it starts to shift. It becomes the faith, a fixed body of correct teachings, almost like a deposit of official doctrine that has to be guarded against all these weird Gnostic ideas. The author also uses this really powerful medical metaphor. He constantly calls the correct teaching hygienis, which literally means healthy or sound. And by contrast, what's heresy? He says it spreads like gangrene. The message couldn't be clearer. Our teaching brings life and health. Their teaching is a disease that brings death. The final piece of this linguistic puzzle is a single word, and its importance is driven home by just how often it's used. 10 times. A very specific word appears 10 times. But what is it? And why on earth does it matter so much? That word is eusebeia, or godliness. It shows up 10 times in these 3 short letters, which is a huge deal because it's super rare in Paul's other writings. This was no accident. It was a strategic move to push for proper, respectable, orderly religious behavior, a stark contrast to what they saw as the radical, socially disruptive teachings of the Gnostics. So, when you put all these clues together, the targeted phrases, the decoded words, the direct counterarguments, a really clear picture starts to form. This wasn't some friendly academic debate over coffee. This was a war of words, fought in the trenches of early church communities. It was a desperate struggle to define the very soul of Christianity for all the generations that would follow. It just shows how contested and, frankly, how fragile the faith was in those early days. The winners got to call themselves Orthodox. The losers were branded heretics. And all of this leaves us with one last pretty crucial question. This ancient battle shows how language can build walls and define who's in and who's out. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do the words we choose, the slogans we repeat, and the ideas we attack draw the boundaries for our own groups and communities today?